Leading a startup team, whether you're delivering a sugar rush, stocking coffee, or getting a regular delivery of snacks, Office Depot has solutions that fit every startup culture, from getting those first business cards and stationery to ordering fleece pullovers with your new logo. To learn how Office Depot and the California Technology Council have partnered to bring you savings on all of these startup essentials and more, go to californiatechnology.org/member benefits. I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. As the debate over drug pricing intensifies, biotech investor Peter Kolchinsky is weighing in with a proposed approach to balance access to medicines with the incentive for companies to invest in the development of innovative therapies. In his new book, The Great American Drug Deal, Kolchinsky makes the case for an approach to drug pricing that would ensure the timely movement of innovative drugs to generic versions, while also suggesting mechanisms for cutting the price of therapeutics after patents and exclusivity periods expire when competition fails to arise. We spoke to Kolchinsky about the Great American Drug Deal, his notion of a biotech social contract, and why it's critical that the industry think differently than it has in the past about approaches to reform drug pricing. Peter, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Daniel.
We're going to talk about your new book, The Great American Drug Deal, drug pricing, and how we can balance access and innovation. Perhaps we can start with defining the challenge that's before us. What was the problem you were trying to address?
Sure. So, I've spent my career looking for new technologies, interesting new drug candidates that my team could help support to become new drugs. A lot of my work is really in the science and the clinical data, and my assumption had been that when we succeed, we help patients, we make a difference in the world, and I knew that the public had trouble dealing with the high prices of drugs, but we've long had lobby groups in the industry that sort of stood up for the value that the industry was offering. And I assumed when in 2015 there was a particularly fierce uproar over Turing price jacking an old drug, Daraprim, I assumed that the industry would have a cogent response and reassure the public and Congress that these are outliers, these are not reflective of the biopharmaceutical business model. But it's not really what I heard. What I heard was patients, and on behalf of patients, the media and members of Congress saying, patients can't afford drugs. People can't afford their insulin, right? That was clear, and that was outrageous. And what the industry said was, well, drug development's very expensive, it's risky. And it's like, well, wait a second, that's not an answer to the question that's being posed. The answer is, it's terrible that patients can't afford what their doctors are prescribing. It's essential that they be able to afford and access what their doctors are prescribing. That's what insurance is for, right? And if you can't afford what your doctor prescribes, it means that America's insurance system has failed you. Now, as for whether or not America is getting value for drugs, that's another question. That's not exactly the question that patients are asking, but it was certainly on the minds of members of the media and Congress. And there's a different answer. Again, one that the industry wasn't giving. It's that yes, our drugs definitely offer value, and all you have to do to see that is to just look back at all of the drugs that we've invested in, that were expensive to develop, and now are available for pennies a pill as generics. We've got billions, tens of billions of dollars of research, hundreds of billions of dollars of research that are now available as really inexpensive pennies a pill generic drugs. And all the drugs that we are paying high prices for now will or should eventually go generic and continue to offer humanity value for the rest of all time. We are paying off mortgages on assets that the public will own, right? And if we're still spending the $271 billion on branded drugs that we spent in 2018, if we're still spending that in 15 years, it's because every drug we have today has gone generic, and we have invented an entirely new set of drugs, right? That doesn't happen in any other area of healthcare. Hospitals and surgeries do not go generic. Drugs offer the best value of anything in healthcare, with the one caveat being, by the way, that actually some drugs don't go generic. They can't go generic, and that is a problem. That's a violation of what I came to call the biotech social contract, and that can be fixed with reforms. At the moment, it's a relatively small part of our expenditures, but it could grow over time, so we definitely should nip it in the bud now.
Well,
right? I wasn't hearing industry saying that, but those were the ideas that were rattling around in my mind, and eventually I buckled down and just started writing. At first I wrote articles, and then eventually as I answered a lot of the questions that came up, like, but what about the EpiPen, and what about direct-to-consumer advertising, I wrote more articles. And eventually I had enough material there that I felt I needed to stitch it together into a cogent book. And that's the book that you have in front of you.
This is an industry that's extending lives, enabling people with chronic conditions to lead normal lives, and even now producing functional cures for deadly and disabling diseases. And yet it finds itself now ranked in the most recent Gallup survey on public perceptions of industries as being the most reviled industry in the country. What role has pricing played in this, and do you think it suggests some failure on the part of the industry to tell its story or make its case?
So I definitely think that the industry has not told its story effectively over time. But the biggest misunderstanding that the public has is that the price of drugs is not directly responsible for the lack of affordability, right? What patients pay is a function of insurance. What society as a whole pays, yes, that is a function of drug prices, right? And so when you have an expensive drug, maybe for cystic fibrosis, a drug that costs $200,000, there is, practically speaking, no discount that you can negotiate from that company without driving into the ground that will make that drug affordable for patients. You can take a 50% haircut on all the branded expensive drugs that are out there, and you still would not make them affordable directly to patients. That requires insurance. But a 50% haircut on all those prices would wipe out the industry. It would take far less of a cut than that to eliminate profits, eliminate executive compensation, basically reduce the industry to a modestly compensated nonprofit, right? And I don't think that would drive innovation. That's not going to attract the kinds of billions and billions of dollars of private capital required to fund these risky clinical trials. Meanwhile, a 50% haircut on all these drugs will not have made these drugs more affordable. A patient can no more afford a $100,000 drug than a $200,000 drug. You need insurance for that, right? If America were to pay for, basically protecting ourselves against fire, right? Fire departments, the way that we pay for healthcare, you would have a town fire department that says, well, of course we have to fund ourselves, at least 20 or 30% of our budget by charging families co-payments if their houses are on fire. And if they can't pay the co-payment, I guess we're just going to have to stand there and let their house burn, right? And so we would be watching as families, lose everything with a fire truck standing outside their home on the street, just idly, waiting for their house to burn and maybe protecting the neighboring houses from catching fire. So, people would be outraged over that. Yet it doesn't happen because we properly insure Americans against fire. We actually pay fully for fire departments out of taxes. And that's what insurance premiums are. You can call them what you like, insurance premiums or taxes. The bottom line is healthcare is a right in America. We all feel it. We treat it like it's a right. We're outraged when somebody goes without care. And as a right, it's something that we should be funding for across the board, from our cumulative income. We've got $17 trillion of income in the United States. You can't tell me that out of that budget we can't afford to pay the $271 billion for branded drugs and the $70-some billion for generics on behalf of those few Americans, comparatively speaking, who need care. We absolutely can make all drugs affordable.
Before we get into specific proposals in the book, I wanted to take a step back as someone with visibility into the thinking within a drug company. How do companies set prices for their products? What are the considerations they make?
Well, I think that it helps to think about a moment when someone is considering starting up just a discovery project. You think you figured out what the problem is with a given disease. Protein X. If we can just inhibit protein X, we will solve disease X. And the question becomes, should we invest in that lab experiment to try to develop an inhibitor for protein X? And it's going to be risky. It's going to be expensive. And based on precedents, that if this drug can generate, let's say, $500 million or $1 billion worth of revenue per year for the typical lifespan of a brand of drug, the patent protected period, which is 10 to 15 years, then that generally that's the kind of development program that will attract funding from other investors, right? That if all it can generate, if all you offer up is a drug that's going to sell $50 or $100 million a year, it won't. It won't be attractive to investors. It will not get the funding, the hundreds of millions of dollars that will be required at a minimum to develop that drug. And so you take a number like $500 million or $700 million of U.S. sales, sales in America, and you ask yourself, all right, how many patients are likely to need that drug? And if the answer is, well, probably about 1 million, right? 1 million patients. Then you think like, all right, well, it sounds like we could basically charge like $1,000 a year for this drug. And if 1 million patients were to get it, that would be $1 billion drug. Yeah, $1,000 doesn't sound like it's much. Well, the trouble is that there aren't too many diseases, where you can develop a drug and treat 1 million patients. In fact, those are the most expensive diseases to develop drugs for. Increasingly, we're finding that in order to develop a drug for a disease, you have to narrowly define that disease, and be so precise that there may be only tens of thousands of patients who are going to need it, right? And so if it turns out that you've got 10,000 patients that you think might need treatment, then dividing $1 billion by 10,000 means you're going to have to charge $100,000 per patient. And, if you read what's out there in the press and what Congress is saying, and you start to think, yeah, I don't think that by the time we bring this drug to market, if we're successful, that the public and Congress are going to be supportive of paying $100,000 per patient. I think that they will have a Congress that has now decided that the government gets to quote unquote negotiate price, which is to say, just tell you what it's going to pay, or else you can take a hike. And that they will run some math models like what ICER does that says, I think this is worth maybe $10,000. We'll pay you a tenth of what you're asking for. Then I just can't develop that drug, because I don't think I'm going to be able to charge the $100,000 per patient it's going to take. So I'm going to have to stop this project right now while it's just in the cradle, right? And so the ability to fund these, from inception requires the faith that the United States ultimately is going to be willing to pay, something like $100,000 for a disease where there might be 10,000 patients, or maybe more than $100,000 for certain cases. Certainly, if I think that insurance companies are going to say, oh, this is so expensive, I'm going to limit it to the most severely affected patients with this disease. I'm going to let only 2,000 patients get this drug. Well, then you're going to change your math. You're going to say, well, then I'm going to take $1 billion and divide by 2,000. Do I believe that then society will pay $500,000 per year for just the most severely affected 2,000 patients? And that's kind of a shame, right? Because if you thought society would be willing to let all 10,000 patients have the drug, you would charge $100,000. But if you think that society is going to find $100,000 too much and limit it to only the most severe, you charge $500,000. And if society is going to say, oh, 500 is so much, we're going to limit it only to the most severe 100 patients, well, then what? You're going to charge $10 million per patient? And you're probably going to say, no, it sounds like the math is just undoable. That, there is no finding a price multiplied by a number of patients that will get me to the reward, that will let me inspire investors to fund this. So I should just call it all off. So that's the dampening effect that all of this rhetoric, could potentially have on investment, that we lose faith that America is going to be willing to pay for success if and when we're successful.
There's a tendency to consider drug pricing as a thing unto itself as opposed to part of the healthcare ecosystem. Is it a mistake to look at this in a self-contained way rather than as a component of a healthcare system in need of reform?
I think that it's certainly important that we think about drug development, incentivizing and fueling drug development by paying for branded drugs as part of certainly our healthcare system. And that's because when people suffer from diseases, like in the book, for example, I talk about the need for hip replacement surgery, that, we've got 400,000 hip replacements in the U.S. each year, and they cost something on the order of $40,000 each, and that's not counting the months and months of rehabilitation that patients need. You're talking about north of $16 billion a year of spending on hip replacement surgeries. Now, there's no one corporation that America can hate, that's charging $16 billion for a hip replacement product. This is the cost of hospitals and hospital beds and surgeons and some, medical devices. And so those costs are spread out so that the public kind of doesn't really have a particular target for its outrage over spending. But imagine if a company developed a drug that strengthened bones, right? And by strengthening our bones, it cut the number of hip replacements dramatically, let's say in half, right? That would be profound. And let's say that drug initially was priced such that all the patients taking it collectively generated $10 billion in revenues. So let's say it shaved half of your $16 billion that you're spending on hip replacements, so that's $8 billion less, but you're spending $10 billion on the drug. So initially, you're spending a couple $1 billion more than you would have if you'd never invented the drug. Does the public see that it's spending $2 billion more? No. It just sees a single company raking in $10 billion, and it hates that company. And Congress vilifies that company, and the media vilifies that company, right? So they don't see the savings. But what's really distressing, I think, is that that drug is going to be expensive for 10 to 15 years. But after that, when it goes generic and becomes extremely inexpensive, it will continue to leave the rate of hip replacement surgeries cut in half. And so that means it'll continue saving $8 billion a year. Except 20 years from now, it's not really saving $8 billion a year because hip replacements would be a lot more expensive and there'll probably be more of them. By that point, society would have probably be spending something like $30 billion a year, if we hadn't invented the drug. But because we'll have invented it and it's generic, we'll be spending, let's say, half. We'll be shaving $15 billion of spending. So any American, that's ever paid rent on an apartment or thought about buying a house would recognize that it's worth paying a bit more, in a mortgage for a finite period of time and then own a home than be stuck paying rent forever. People get that. But when it comes to drug pricing and, the value that it offers society, people don't get it. They don't see that drugs that will go generic an asset that you can acquire through a mortgage, whereas things like, surgery and rehabilitation, those are rents. Rents we will be stuck paying for forever if we don't invent, manufactured goods called drugs to basically prevent them.
Throughout the book, you talk about a biotech social contract. What do you mean by the term biotech social contract?
Sure. So, essentially what I would say is that the biotech social contract, if you were to write some kind of a document, like what the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and Declaration of Independence are for America, right? A statement of our values and how we will conduct ourselves and what each citizen owes to the country and what the country owes to each citizen. If we were to create such a document governing the relationship between all of us as a community, society, and the portion of our society that we've charged with making drugs, then I would call it the biotech social contract, and it would go like this, that the biotechnology industry, which includes pharmaceutical companies, I don't really make a distinction, we can call it the biopharmaceutical industry, basically the drug development industry commits to making drugs that will go generic without undue delay, and in exchange, society will make it affordable for patients through proper insurance with, minimal or no out-of-pocket costs to make it affordable for patients to receive the drugs that their physicians prescribe to actually get proper treatment, right? So proper insurance in exchange for genericizable drugs. And that way, all patients can afford what their doctors are prescribing, and America continues to get value for its mortgage payments. It will continue to pay off drugs, and it build this giant generic drug mountain that we've already got, and basically improve healthcare, standard of care, year after year after year, without the cost stacking. When you think about every single problem that we've faced with the lack of affordability or the EpiPen or insulin or anything like that, it's if you align it against the biotech social contract, what I found is that the solution presents itself. Right? So how are patients who are in desperate fear of coronavirus, those with respiratory infections and older patients, what if they have poor insurance? How are they going to afford the treatments that we're rushing to develop for coronavirus? Well, the answer is not, having some nonprofit try to develop a vaccine or whatever. The answer is insurance. And that insurance can come from their insurance plans, or maybe the government just declares that, society will guarantee you that if you need a treatment for coronavirus, it will pay for that out of a special fund. Right? Insurance takes many forms.
You call this a social contract, but a social contract is an implicit agreement. You're really talking about a much more formalized contract.
Well, yes and no. A social I would argue that the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, is a social contract, right? Certainly, it exists because we all believe in it, right? But it also is backed by the force of law. It is law, right? And so there are aspects of the biotech social contract that, in order to be put into effect, require rules and regulations that don't yet exist. So I would not expect, for example, that insurance companies are going to suddenly wake up one day and say, oh, we're all just going to do the right thing and make, all appropriate treatments affordable to all patients. We'll lower out-of-pocket costs. They won't do that. I think technically it would be collusion for them to all get into one room and discuss what they're all going to do. So the FTC would probably block that as much as it would be in the public's interest. But also, if any one of them went first, they would worry that their plan would now be a bit more expensive than their competitor's plan, and some company that's shopping around for a healthcare plan for its employees, would go for the cheaper plan, right? So they would be afraid to lose business. So if Congress were to pass a law that says nobody can sell insurance in America and call it insurance unless it has certain caps on out-of-pocket costs. Let's say nobody can be charged more than $500 a year in out-of-pocket costs, and people who make below a certain amount of income cannot be charged, any out-of-pocket costs. If there were a law that said that, then all insurance plans would have to compete, within the constraints of that law. And so they would all try to run themselves as efficiently as possible and, win business. And just like Congress outlawed, discrimination against patients based on pre-existing conditions, Congress can pass a law, and in fact, there are several laws being proposed to cap out-of-pocket costs. So that would now help bring about at least that side of the biotech social contract. And as for all drugs going generic without undue delay, well, that too, as I discussed in the book, requires actually a new regulation. It's not like a radically novel one. It basically just says when there's a product that has a natural monopoly, like it cannot be commoditized. Nobody can make a copy of it and compete in the market. So a gene therapy oftentimes would be ungenericizable. Then a natural monopoly should be regulated. And so after what I propose in the book is that after an initial period that would be covered by the initial patents, that the drug be put under a price control regime that would drop its price to, let's say, 2 times the cost of production, as if it had gone generic. And so you will achieve through this price regulation what would have otherwise been achievable through competition if it were the kind of drug that could be genericized.
I think that's one of the more compelling aspects to what you've done here, where you've inserted what I'd call safeguards to ensure adherence to what you're calling a social contract. I'm wondering, in the area of biologics, we've really not seen a robust biosimilar market emerge yet in the United States, and the products that have biosimilars have fallen far short of the savings that you'd see with generic drugs. Do you see that type of price control, or whatever you want to call, do you see that addressing the problem we've had in regards to biologics?
Absolutely. And, a simpler way to think of it, price control is already a loaded term. I call it contractual genericization, right? So it echoes the idea of a biotech social contract. So there's genericization of a drug through competition, because lots of generics companies can make copies of a drug. Lipitor, easy to make a copy of it, and there were dozens of companies making it, so the price collapsed by well over 90%. But a gene therapy, you just can't make a copy of it. Well, there are certain types of drugs like antibodies where you can make a copy, it's just really expensive. These biosimilars are really expensive, so you get only a few companies making competing products. I think that what that does is it creates oligopolies. You go from a monopoly to an oligopoly. And the trouble is that sometimes an oligopoly can still result in some reductions in price, but not really the kind of precipitous declines that you expect from genericization. And having contractual genericization as a backstop to basically say, look, you've invented a great drug, you collected mortgage payments from society for, a reasonable period of time, whatever your patent lasted 13 years, let's say, and now society is owed the asset that it has paid off. It should be able to access that inexpensively, as close to your cost of production. And it would be great to diversify the supply. It would be great if multiple other manufacturers stepped in. That would be nice. But frankly, that is less important than making sure that one way or the other, society gets the asset that it paid off at a low cost. So here's what we're going to do. On the day that your drug is supposed to go contractually generic, you will drop the price to 2 times your cost of production. If it turns out that that is a ceiling and that others are capable of competing with you at a price lower than that, great. Then there's still room for competition. If you had if you set a price like that, for Lipitor, I wonder whether somebody would have stepped in and said, oh, well, I can make it even cheaper than that. I'll still compete with you. So you might have still had a vibrant generics market at below those prices. But if no one else can, if no one wants to compete with you at that price, then that's fine too, because one way or the other, the public is going to get what it paid for. It will get your drug inexpensively.
One other area that you address is the way companies today try to fight generic competition, particularly through what would be incremental improvements to existing therapeutics, which you acknowledge have value. What's the vision you have in both encouraging those types of improvements while preventing them from forestalling competition?
Yeah, so a very basic improvement, right, would be taking a drug that initially, when it was launched, had to be taken twice a day, and eventually, you find a way to formulate it so that you can take it as a single pill once a day, right? That's a nice upgrade, and today, a company will do that. So Pfizer, for example, their drug Lyrica went generic last year. And it's a big selling drug. It's an important drug. It treats neuropathic pain and a few other disorders. And they have Lyrica CR, which is CR stands for controlled release. And, that's a once daily version of Lyrica. So Lyrica, the regular Lyrica, went generic. So there are now generics under the generic name pregabalin out there that are inexpensive. But Lyrica CR is still a branded drug. I think it's branded until the year 2026. And the thing is that insurance companies would be entirely within their right, I believe, to say, we're just not paying any more for Lyrica CR than for the generics, right? Having a drug that costs a lot more for just the slight convenience of being taken once a day, that's not worth it. That's not good value. I would hope that they would recognize that there's a little bit of value there, going from twice a day to once a day. I mean, to the extent that everybody would be more adherent to the medicine, and it allows them to not think, about taking their drug as much. That's a good thing. It's something I would want in a generic that we're going to be using for the rest of all time. But I could see how insurance companies would say it's not worth it, right? And so would Pfizer have developed it if they knew that as soon as their original Lyrica went generic, they basically wouldn't get paid for this new version of Lyrica CR? So that would be a shame, right, if they never developed that in the first place. And so I would argue that you could have given Pfizer 6 more months of market exclusivity for Lyrica in exchange for upgrading it to a once daily, and then allowed that now upgraded drug to go generic 6 months later than it otherwise would have. We already do that to entice companies into running pediatric trials so that we know we have actual data on how to use drugs that were developed for adults properly in kids, right? Otherwise, if we didn't get those kinds of data, companies, might not feel compelled to study how to use drugs that are meant for diseases that adults get, might not be compelled to study them in children, given that maybe very few children would have neuropathic pain and need them, and therefore it's not enough of a market. And so the FDA explicitly incentivizes it by extending Pfizer's patents by 6 more months and giving them 6 more months of revenues, which in the case of Lyrica was billions of dollars, right? So I'm just proposing using such short exclusivity extensions as an incentive to make these modest upgrades. Today, actually, the reason Pfizer does make money from Lyrica CR is because of a perversity in our insurance system. The PBMs, which are agents for our insurance companies, they are collecting a big kickback from Pfizer for Lyrica CR. And so it's in their interest to see Lyrica CR used by many patients. They, condoned Pfizer paying the co-payments with patient assistance programs for Lyrica CR, right? And the PBMs will tell their clients, the insurance companies, oh, yes, well, we're extracting big rebates. Here you go, from Lyrica CR. But in reality, the PBMs are keeping a sliver of that. So they're basically getting a kickback from encouraging the use of this upgraded drug. And, that may sort of be fine and that incentivizes that innovation. But the reality is that those kickbacks, end up costing patients very dearly in other ways. Those, for example, who don't have insurance will find that when there's a unique drug that they need, that drug's list price might be inflated because PBMs have urged companies, I want you to charge a very high list price so that I can look like a hero and negotiate down rebates. I want to look like I've negotiated these huge rebates off of you, and therefore my client will think that I'm really useful. And so you see these list prices of drugs going up and up and up, and the rebates climbing as well. The net prices on drugs have not been increasing for the last few years, right? But when patients who don't have insurance or have to pay for drugs out of their deductible, out of pocket, are given a price, it's based on that list price. So I actually would like to see PBMs become unaddicted from rebates because that would be better for patients, and I discuss that in the book. But if that happens, then Pfizer might not make money off Lyrica CR anymore, right? And therefore, they might not be incentivized to develop it in the first place. So that's why I propose contractual genericization as a backstop for all drugs to ensure they go generic, but to preserve the incentives for incremental innovation by extending the date when your drug is going to go generic. Incremental incentive is basically for incremental innovation.
What's the plan going forward? Are you doing things to get industry and policymakers to embrace these proposals?
So the articles that I'd written a couple of years ago, and now the book that I put out, have kicked off some really interesting conversations around the industry, some of which I've been invited to be a part of. And so I get to see that the gears are turning throughout the industry at some very large companies that are, made up of people that are trying to do the right thing, right? They're trying to figure out how to launch a new drug that they know that the public might be, concerned about. It might generate considerable revenues. And yet when they launch, they want to make sure that it's presented to the public in a way that gets people to see the value that society's going to get. And, they're uncertain as to how to present, their drugs, given all the hatred, frankly, that's out there, right? And so, we've seen how payers reacted to the PCSK9 inhibitors. And I think that any company launching a new drug, it feels, burned by that. Even if it's not Amgen and Sanofi and Regeneron with the PCSK9s, every company, I think, was affected by the public's reaction to those drugs, which are some of the most innovative and valuable drugs we've ever created. And so I've been asked to come in and brainstorm with people in a number of companies to figure out, what does it mean to say we're launching this drug and we want to launch it in accordance with the biotech social contract? Like, how do we present that, right? And I think that that's a really great question. It's a question we should have always been asking ourselves, and we haven't. Now we're starting to, right? How do we present the value proposition? And one of the first things that I will ask any such company is, will your drug go readily generic? And in some cases, the answer is no. And, it's pretty complicated to make. I think it's going to be hard for others to make a copy. And I would say, okay, well, are you prepared to commit to having your price drop after your patents expire, allowing for some extensions of that if you end up upgrading your drug? And I wish I could tell you right now that the answer is that they all say wholeheartedly, yes, we commit to it. Actually, some have said that. Yes, we totally would. If we thought that that is what would allow all the patients who are going to need our drug to actually be able to access it, if society would honor its end of the social contract by properly covering our drug, then yes, we would commit to having our drug drop in price when it goes, when the patents expire. But others, have said, we're going to have to discuss that, right? I mean, it's a big commitment. But all of them, I think, at the moment realize that unless there is a mechanism by which society can take its end of the contract and enforce it, that all they can do, all the people who are in these companies can do is speak for themselves. But, certainly in the case of public companies, the boards can turn over, the shareholders can turn over, and they can just rescind any, public promise that they have made, right? And so, as nice as it is that, companies are actually mulling this idea and seriously considering what contractual genericization might mean for them, the reality is that we need to be supportive as an industry of laws, of, new regulations that make contractual genericization possible for those drugs that can't go generic. And, at the moment, two of the major lobby groups, Bio and Pharma, they have read my book. I have spoken with them about contractual genericization. And they're a lot more open-minded than you might think of organizations representing big companies as being. So that's promising. But I think that probably some of the nervousness might be that, well, what if we say that we are open to contractual genericization and Congress merely says, oh, great, then here, we'll impose it. But they won't, then act on the other side of it, lowering out-of-pocket costs. What if it's simply something that the industry ends up giving up and getting nothing in return, right? And so what I'm, advocating for is not that the industry just says, sure, impose this new regulation on us, but rather use the fact that, this is, something that the industry would be giving up and offer it up as the pound of flesh that Congress clearly wants in exchange for lowering out-of-pocket costs, right? When you look at a bill like H.R. 3, it actually addressed drug prices and out-of-pocket costs for patients. It sort of attempts to formulate a biotech social contract of its own. And the ACA, Obamacare, it's the same way. It was about extending insurance and getting more people covered, but also baked into ACA was biosimilar legislation to try to bring about the genericization of biologics. So you can see that Congress already thinks about these two sides of what previously was an unspoken social contract, and now I'm simply laying it out, right? And so H.R. 3 could have been modified so that instead of imposing price controls on drugs at all points in their lifespan, including at launch, rather you just shift those price controls to the back end after the initial patents have expired and use them to ensure that all drugs become inexpensive after an initial mortgage period. If you had done that to H.R. 3 and then kept the parts of it that lower out-of-pocket costs, you would basically have the legislation that I'm advocating for. So H.R. 3 wasn't that far off the mark. Just leave the out-of-pocket cost reductions. In fact, extend them to private insurance as well, because it really only talks about Medicare. And then take your price controls and shift them to the back end after the patents have expired. That would be great.
The book is The Great American Drug Deal, a new prescription for innovative and affordable medicines. Peter Kolchinsky, founding partner of RA Capital Management, author. Peter, thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me. Take care.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.